All right, so I'm going to try this again, guys. Sorry the last one didn't work with sound. So we need to go over some characteristics of the blood. So we're just going to go over some general characteristics, and then we'll go over red blood cells in this part of the video. So first of all, hematocrit. So a hematocrit is something that will be measured by doctors when they take your blood. And basically it is the percentage of red blood cells in the bloodstream. All right, so that's something that they will check to see, number one, if you are carrying enough oxygen, because red blood cells carry oxygen. And again, it can make it too thick. So what is that percentage supposed to be? So if we go back up here, remember that the formed elements were 45% and the red blood cells are about 99% of that. So if you take 99% of 45, obviously you're going to get just about 45. So the hematocrit should be somewhere around 44 or 45%. And again, doctors will check that when they take your blood to see if you have the proper number of red blood cells, all right, if you're able to do what the blood's supposed to do. And we're going to check that in lab tomorrow. So pH, remember that the blood is mostly water. All right, so it's this liquidy part. Most of that is water. So water's pH is 7. So the blood pH is about 7.35 to 7.45. Slightly basic just because of the other stuff that's dissolved in it. The temperature of the blood, we know body temperature is 98.6. The temperature of the blood is about 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit, so slightly warmer than body temperature. And you should know that because when blood flows to a certain area, like when you get embarrassed and your cheeks get red, you get really hot. As blood is flowing, like when you're exercising and things, you get hot. All right, so blood is a warmer temperature than body temperature. And that's why like your fingers get cold when blood drains from it. Like when you're out in the cold, blood will drain from your fingers and toes first. That's one reason it gets cold. Volume of blood is somewhere between about 5 and 6 liters. So if you think of a 2-liter bottle of soda, you would fill up about 3 of those if I were to drain all of your blood. And obviously it can be less, depending on your size and things like that, or more depending on your size. But that equates to gallons, somewhere around 1.5 gallons. So think of a gallon of milk. You fill up about 1.5 gallons of that. When you give blood, you're giving 1 pint. And 1 pint is about 1/10 of your blood. And that's why you can feel weak after you give blood, because they are taking that out. You will replenish that. It takes a little while to get back. This is why I tell... during track season, they usually have a blood drive in March. Don't give blood the week of a track meet because, you're going to feel it. You're going to notice a difference. You're not going to be able to carry as much oxygen, and we need oxygen to work those muscles. So it's going to take a while, like a week to get back. All right, sometimes. And then the percent of body weight is about 7%. So basically when I step on the scale, 7% of our body weight's due to the blood. All right, so those are just some general characteristics of the blood as a whole. So what I want to take a look at then today are red blood cells. All right, so in this part of the video, I'm just going to concentrate on red blood cells, and then I'll do a separate video on white blood cells, and then one on platelets. So we know the function of red blood cells is to carry oxygen. And basically that is their only job. These are red blood cells over here in 3 dimensions. They don't have a nucleus. They really don't do much else except carry oxygen to parts of the body and deliver that oxygen. And they have this shape. You can see it has like this little dip in it. Well, there's a dip on both sides. They usually call that a biconcave disc. All right, and basically think of that as like a cup to carry oxygen. All right, so that little dip in it allows us to carry oxygen. Counts, I'm going to come back to hemoglobin here. Counts about 5 million per drop of blood. So as I said, if you have trouble finding red blood cells, there's something wrong because they're everywhere. And we're going to do a lab where we try to count that to see if you have, obviously that's what they do to do a hematocrit, right? They've got to count how many red blood cells you have. There's a way to do that so you don't have to count 5 million, don't worry. And red blood cells last about 120 days. So you're constantly making new red blood cells in the bone marrow. All right, that's their job. is to create new, actually all kinds of blood cells, white blood cells and red blood cells. All right, so hemoglobin. So again, the function of red blood cells is to carry oxygen. The reason they can do that is because there is a protein, so this is a protein in the red blood cells that has an affinity for oxygen. So this is a protein that contains iron that attracts oxygen. So the reason that blood cells can carry oxygen is because of hemoglobin. So it contains this protein iron as part of it, and iron and oxygen have an affinity for each other. We see this when something rusts. When something rusts, that turns sort of red. Well, the same thing happens when our blood carries oxygen. It has a red tint, so it's redder. And that's why our blood is red, is because that iron and oxygen, just like rust, turn red. So when we lose that oxygen, or we don't have oxygen attached to the hemoglobin or the iron, it turns like a deeper red. I know a lot of people say it's blue, your blood is blue. It's not really blue, it's more like a deep red. It looks blue like in our veins through our skin, but it's just because it's filtered through the skin. It's not really blue. But so the reason that the red blood cells can do their job is because of that hemoglobin, that carrying oxygen, and that iron and oxygen attach and make it red in color. Okay, so that obviously is a pretty important protein in the red blood cells. All right, so I just then want to lastly talk about a disorder that affects red blood cells a lot, and that is anemia. So the definition of anemia is the reduced capacity to carry oxygen. All right, so basically when you can't carry oxygen, you're going to have some symptoms. You're not going to have enough energy, because we need oxygen to go to our tissues to help us create energy in the mitochondria. You can also be pale. Remember that when oxygen and iron attach, you get sort of a pinkish hue, right? The red tint. And if it's not in your blood, then you can get very pale. So it's not like the pink tint that your skin normally is, but you get pale. And so obviously that can be a problem. You'd be tired very often also, because you're not getting oxygen to your cells, right? Not getting energy. So anything that decreases the capacity to carry oxygen, that can cause anemia. So if we were in class, I would be asking, what could reduce your capacity to carry oxygen, and ask for some things, but now today I'm just going to have to give them to you. Probably the number one thing here is lack of iron. So if we go back, remember iron is part of hemoglobin, and that's what has affinity for oxygen. So if you don't have enough iron in your diet, you can have anemia, because that hemoglobin doesn't work. So lack of iron can be meats, fish, things like that have iron. So that can be a problem for anemia. I know that when I give blood, that's why when you give blood, one of the first things they do is prick your finger and they check your iron levels. They're not going to allow you to donate. It's not that, well, number one, if you're lacking iron, if they take blood from you, it can affect you. But also, they don't want to give your blood to somebody who is in need of a blood transfusion, and you're giving them iron poor blood. All right, they're not going to be able to carry oxygen like they should. So that's not a good thing. So it's bad for you to lose blood when you can't carry oxygen in the first place if you're anemic, and bad for the person they're giving it to. So I know that I take iron supplements or vitamins that have 100% iron because I know that I lack iron. So when they do that fingerprint for me, when I give blood, I'm usually right on the cusp of being anemic. So I know that. And I will tell you that women typically are anemic more often than men, and that is because of low red blood cell numbers. So that's another cause of anemia. Obviously, if you have low red blood cells, you're not going to be able to carry oxygen. The reason that women have low red blood cells more often than men, size, number one, and because women menstruate, they're going to lose blood once a month, so they're going to have a lower number of red blood cells because they're bleeding. All right, so obviously if you have internal bleeding, or if you just were in an accident, that can cause low red blood cell numbers also. There is a specific type of anemia called sickle cell anemia. This is an inherited trait. And basically what happens is your hemoglobin does not come out properly. Basically, you don't make the right kind of hemoglobin, and it's and it doesn't have an affinity for oxygen then. And then that hemoglobin in the red blood cells, it causes your red blood cells to be like a sickle shape like that instead of the nice round shape. All right, and that's why it's called sickle cell anemia. Those sickle-shaped red blood cells can get stuck in your arteries and veins also and get clots. All right, so that can be a problem also. All right, and the last cause I will talk about is carbon monoxide poisoning. So basically what happens is that carbon monoxide has a greater affinity for iron or for oxygen than does the red blood cells and hemoglobin. So it will bond to oxygen before your red blood cells do, and it will prevent your red blood cells from carrying oxygen to your tissues. And obviously then you're not getting oxygen there, you can't create energy. Usually with carbon monoxide poisoning, you fall asleep and basically can die that way if it's very severe, because you're not getting oxygen to your tissues, you're not being able to create energy. All right, so that's a pretty rare one, but it can happen. So I would say definitely the most common is lack of iron, and low red blood cells would be the causes of anemia when dealing with red blood cells. All right, so that's the notes on red blood cells, and then I'll do another one for white blood cells.